What if I told you that Karbala did not begin with swords, but with silence? What if the greatest battle in Islamic history was not fought on a battlefield, but inside the human conscience? This is not a story about Muslims alone. This is a story about truth, power, and the price of remaining silent. This is the story of how Islam was tested and how humanity was saved. This story begins in a time when the world was alive, yet humanity was lost. People breathed, walked, and spoke, but justice had no voice. Power decided truth, strength defined honor, and the weak existed only to serve the strong. In the deserts of Arabia, tribal loyalty was law, the sword was justice, and compassion was seen as weakness. Daughters were buried alive, slaves were treated as property, and gods were carved from stone while human conscience slowly turned to dust. It was into this world that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born. No crown awaited him, no army stood behind him, and no palace announced his arrival. Yet history would later testify that no individual transformed the moral direction of humanity the way he did. When he proclaimed the message of Islam, it was not a call to power, wealth, or dominance. It was a call to awaken the human soul, to recognize one God, and through that recognition, to restore dignity to every human being. Islam did not begin as a religion of rituals alone. It began as a revolution of conscience. It challenged injustice, questioned inherited oppression, and demanded accountability from the powerful. That is why its earliest followers were the poor, the enslaved, and the forgotten. And that is also why its strongest enemies were those who benefited from corruption and hierarchy. Islam threatened not their faith, but their control. The Prophet Muhammad did not rule through fear. He ruled through character. He did not command loyalty through force, but earned it through trust. When he established a community in Medina, it was not a kingdom, but a moral society, where the leader was accountable, where justice applied equally, and where power existed to serve, not dominate. Leadership was a responsibility, not a privilege. Authority was a burden, not a right. This principle was the soul of Islam, and this soul would later be tested. After the Prophet passed away, the Muslim community entered a new phase. Leadership continued, and for a time, the values of justice, consultation, and humility remained alive. The early leaders lived simply, answered to the people, and feared accountability before God more than loyalty from men. But as years passed, the world expanded, wealth flowed in, and political complexity increased. And with expansion came temptation. Slowly, the meaning of leadership began to change. What was once service started becoming control. What was once trust started turning into entitlement. The idea that authority should be earned through character began to weaken, and the idea that power could be inherited began to rise. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened quietly, gradually, through compromises that felt small at the time but carried enormous consequences. Internal conflicts shook the community. Political struggles exhausted people. War made stability feel more important than justice. Many began to believe that silence was safer than truth, and peace was worth any price. This collective fatigue created the perfect environment for power to separate itself from morality. Eventually, leadership took a form that Islam was never meant to become. Authority was no longer questioned. The ruler was no longer accountable. Governance was no longer a trust, but a possession. And at that moment, Islam faced its greatest danger, not from enemies outside, but from distortion within. It was in this climate that Yazid came to power. The issue was not merely political succession. The issue was moral legitimacy. Leadership in Islam was never meant to belong to someone because of lineage or force. It was meant to belong to someone because of integrity. Yazid represented a system where power demanded obedience without deserving respect. And then came the demand that would expose the soul of the Ummah. Allegiance was demanded from Husayn ibn Ali. Husayn was not a politician. He was not seeking power. He was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, raised in the household where truth was lived, not spoken. He had seen Islam practiced as mercy, humility, and justice. He understood that allegiance was not a formality, it was a moral endorsement. To give it meant to validate a system that contradicted the very essence of Islam. Husayn understood something that history often forgets. When falsehood wears the clothes of religion, silence becomes betrayal. And when injustice claims divine legitimacy, refusal becomes obligation. He was faced with a choice that defines human conscience. He could comply and live in comfort. He could remain silent and preserve his safety. Or he could refuse and lose everything. Husayn chose the path that preserved Islam, not himself. His refusal was not rebellion, it was preservation. It was a declaration that Islam cannot survive as a tool of oppression. That faith loses its meaning when it becomes a servant of power. That truth does not negotiate with falsehood. This is where Karbala truly begins, not on a battlefield, but in the human soul. Husayn knew the consequences of his decision. He was not naive. He understood the imbalance of power. He knew that standing alone against a state meant isolation, suffering, and death. But he also knew something greater. That if he remained silent, Islam would survive in name but die in spirit. And a religion without spirit becomes an empty shell. He did not rise for power. He did not march for conquest. He rose so that people could once again distinguish between truth and falsehood. He rose so that future generations would know that Islam does not belong to kings. It belongs to conscience. His journey was not a military campaign. It was a moral stand. He traveled with his family, with children, with the people he loved most. Not because he underestimated the danger, but because his mission was not violence. It was testimony. He was showing the world that his stand was not political ambition, but ethical responsibility. This is why Karbala is not owned by Muslims alone. It belongs to every human being who has ever faced injustice. It belongs to anyone who has been asked to compromise their values for safety. It belongs to every soul that has stood at the crossroads of truth and comfort. Islam, at its core, is not about domination. It is about liberation. It liberates the human being from fear of power, from worship of authority, and from obedience to injustice. Husayn's sacrifice was the highest expression of this liberation. He taught the world that dignity is worth more than life, and truth is worth more than survival. Karbala was not a sudden event. It was the result of years of moral erosion, silent compromises, and ignored warnings. It was the moment when history demanded clarity, and Husayn provided it with his blood. This story does not end here, because the desert still lies ahead. Letters will be written, promises will be broken, and the loneliness of truth will become visible under the burning sun. But before we walk into that desert, we must understand this. Karbala was not about who won or lost. It was about what was saved. Islam was saved from becoming a crown. Faith was saved from becoming a slogan. Humanity was reminded that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is participation. And this is why, centuries later, Husayn still speaks, not through speeches but through conscience, not through armies but through tears. He does not ask you what religion you belong to, he asks you one question only. When truth stands alone, where will you stand?